Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to thank the World Student Environmental Summit for this invitation. It's really a thrill to be here in Lausanne and to be able to meet with you. And I wanted to thank Pauline Francois for all her help in organizing this for me, the University of Lausanne for sponsoring this in this astonishingly beautiful location, and my colleague Dominique Bourg, who is a professor here at the University of Lausanne. He teaches in the Institut des Politiques Territoriales et de l'Environnement Humain. And he and I have been collaborating ever since about 2003 on various environmental issues. And so he's partly responsible, of course, for my invitation here. And my instructions are to speak to you in English. Yes. For which I'm somewhat grateful. It puts me quite a bit more at ease than I would be. Usually when Dominique gets me involved in something, I find myself before some prestigious French academy, and I spend a week beforehand trying to perfect my French and so forth. I didn't have to do that in the hotel last night. But I'm also a little ambivalent about it, to tell you the truth. English is becoming the language of the world. And you all speak English and understand English, but English also carries with it certain values that have accumulated over the last 2 centuries. It's very easy to speak the language of individualism, of contracts, of commerce, of standardization. Those are really easy things to talk about in English. Words like solidarity, though, are they're foreign words, actually, in the English language. It's not something that's easy to talk about. Sustainability, complexity, things that matter a lot to people with environmental concerns are not so easily expressed in English. And so I think one of the things that you should keep in mind as students who already understand English is maybe you can help green our language a little bit, or the language that is becoming this sort of universal language. You need some more poetic terms than complexity and sustainability. But each of your languages probably has some terms in it that could be used to enrich English. And I encourage you to find ways to bring those into your discourse and to talk to other people using some of those terms. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about environmental challenges, especially global environmental challenges, from the perspective of political theory. That's my training. And political theory deals with vast questions of legitimacy, large-scale political organization, values as they're expressed in political life. So I'm not going to be talking perhaps at the same level of sort of policy implementation that you may have encountered in some other sessions, but rather I'm going to try to do sort of some of the, raise some issues that come out of some larger perspectives. One of the reference points that I like to use to start any sort of discussion of environmental issues is a work in French that was published in 1968. So it's a very early work in the environmental movement. It's called Un essai sur l'histoire humaine de la nature, an essay on the human history of nature, by a French sociologist named Serge Moscovici. And one of the things that he does in this work is he locates what he calls the natural question in the context of a series of huge political and economic transformations that have occurred in the last 3 centuries. He goes back to the 18th century and he says the preoccupying question of the 18th century was the political question. It was the problem of trying to extend representation from just the king and his counselors and the nobility to the larger society as a whole. So we're talking about the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the other sort of democratic revolutions that followed. In the 19th century, he said, there was a predominance of what he calls the social question. It's the question of how to mitigate some of the inequalities generated by capitalism. And so he's talking about the origins of socialism and the origins of the welfare state in various policies. But then he says, and this is in 1968, he says the 20th century and succeeding centuries are going to be dominated by the natural question. And here's how he describes it. He says, consciously and methodically, we are now capable of intervening in the biological balance of most plant and animal species, of preserving them or destroying them, of altering the climate, of modifying the cycle of energy transformations. Our geomorphic actions henceforth know no limits. We're going to transform the earth. And he argues that this question is going to call forth economic and political and social transformations of the same magnitude of those that were created by those earlier questions, the social question and the political question. In fact, he says that we're going to be moving towards a government of the natural order. Now, here 40 years later, we read about the urgency of the natural question every day. It was barely in the headlines in 1968. Today, it's there all the time, and I'm sure that's what you've been talking about in all of your sessions. We read things like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment of 2005, which reports that people have increased the rate of global extinctions by as much as 1,000 times the natural rate typical of Earth's long-term history. We read about the fact that there's now no hope of meeting even the minimal Kyoto Protocol limitations on carbon emissions. And so we are looking forward to a temperature increase of perhaps 4 to 5 degrees centigrade on average in the planet by the end of this century. So what is called a government of the natural order is only barely perceivable still, if by government you mean some sort of collective action to achieve a sense of the common good. We have gestured towards that, but we haven't really gotten very far, nowhere near far enough to get a handle on the problems I've just described. And what I wanted to emphasize today is that one of the reasons why we're unable to get a more systematic handle on these major problems, I think, is because of the very structures of government that we've inherited from those two preceding eras. It's hard at times for us to grasp really the magnitude of the changes, of the way that our world is changing now in relationship to the ways that people have thought about good governance in the past. In the past, and I'm thinking of people all the way from the Enlightenment, from the origins of representative government. In the past, we've thought that good governance implied somehow creating peace and prosperity among all the competing social interests that inhabited a society. So we had to find terms of cooperation for which the business interests and the workers' interests and the farmers' interests and so forth could get along and achieve enough prosperity to create power for the polity as a whole. But henceforth, and the way that we do that was, of course, to find some sort of mediating institution like a parliament where trade-offs could be arranged. Groups could be satisfied more or less in the long term by being able to elect representatives and then have those representatives bargain for their interest on behalf of their interests in something like a national parliament or an assembly. But now we realize that all of our disputes are caught up with natural systems as well, that they're caught up with ecosystems, with finite supplies of natural resources. And we cannot buy off nature. I mean, nature's responses to our injuries cannot be assuaged or mitigated just by making trade-offs and trying to persuade things. Nature is going to react to the changes that we impose upon it according to its own rules. And so one of the mechanisms of representative government, that way of arranging bargains and trying to create peace among social groups by trading off resources, encounters a limit that it never anticipated. That's one sort of thing that we have to keep in mind. We also have to keep in mind now that many of the goods that we associate with good government, like the fact that it provides us with security, or that it provides us with health care, or it provides us with jobs, all of those things are dependent upon ecological services that can be destroyed or exhausted over time. And therefore, economies may run up against limits in the way that they can supply those expected goods. And then finally, whenever I think about the natural question, I also think about proposed technological remedies. You know, more and more, as we face the real problems of things like climate change, you begin to hear proposals for technological remedies. So maybe one of the remedies for climate change would be something like geoengineering, somehow changing the chemical composition of the oceans so that it would support more algae, so that it would absorb more carbon dioxide. Putting some sort of aerosols in the atmosphere in order to reduce the amount of solar radiation that reaches the Earth's surface. Now, regardless of whether those sorts of projects might even work or not, I'm continually impressed by the magnitude of risk-taking that they involve, and the risk-taking that they would impose on people who are probably not going to be consulted. I mean, it would probably be the most wealthy powers in the world that would undertake any of those efforts at climate change geoengineering. They would be in it gets dramatic at times, I know. But they would be, in a sense, gambling with the conditions that support life on Earth for everybody. What gives them the legitimacy to do that? What gives them is it today's government, today's majority, the last election, that entitles them to make those sorts of decisions? Even if a group of major nations, huge segments of humanity are left out of those sorts of calculations. So the natural question that Serge Moscovici talked about in 1968, it's before us right now, and it's before us forevermore. I mean, it has changed the way in which humanity relates to other people on this earth, and the way it relates to its physical and the physical environment around it. We're never going back to the 18th century in which those questions could simply be laid aside because resources were so abundant and we could simply assume that they could reproduce themselves. Dominique Bourg and I then have been reflecting in sort of the largest terms about what the implications of this level of environmental challenge is for representative democracies. Can we assume that for the foreseeable future, the familiar patterns of governance that we've had with an elected Senate, an elected assembly of some sort, a prime minister with an environmental ministry under him, engaging in international negotiations periodically, can we assume that those sorts of institutions are going to be adequate to the types of challenges that we face in the future? Well, Dominique and I are not convinced that they are. And we're convinced that the best way to start thinking about alternative institutional change in representative democracies is to aim for something that we call an ecological democracy. Something that would, a type of government that would systematically take into account the finitude of nature and the ecological services that we need in order to protect our long-term interests. And so the originality of our work, if it has any, consists in our attempt to describe some institutional structures that we think would be more adequate to the task of responding to the natural question. And I'll admit right now, I don't think we've got all the answers. We're continuing to think about this, continuing to think about what the most balanced perspective for this would be. I interject immediately. We are not talking about abolishing representative government. In fact, one of the ways that environmentalists are frequently discredited by other political parties is by accusations that they have some sort of implicit authoritarianism or some sort of implicit fascism in mind for their society. Dominique and I start from the belief that representative government is a huge achievement that we should not abandon by any means. Representative government stands in opposition to any sort of regime in which lawmakers receive their authority by non-electoral means and exercise power that's insulated from popular criticism. Representative government was invented really in the 18th century in order to give people a voice, to hold their power holders accountable. And those are historic achievements that nobody should call into question lightly. We think, and we agree with many of the major theorists of political representation, people like John Stuart Mill or Condorcet or James Madison, all of whom argued that representation has a way of extending political authority, stable political authority over vast territories, and it's able to do that while maintaining a great deal of freedom, debate, and responsiveness to people. Those are good things, and we do not want to call them into question. But in relationship to the natural question, representative government, we think, has four disabilities, four problems that it continually confronts and is unable to solve because of its internal structure. So I'll just sort of briefly mention what these are. The first disabling feature we think of representative government is that it has a sort of predisposition in favor of undifferentiated economic growth. A predisposition, an inclination, a tendency always to favor undifferentiated economic growth. And by undifferentiated, what I mean is that it tries to create increasing material prosperity for everyone by asking as few questions as possible about the content of growth. In other words, it doesn't like to favor one type of growth over another, one sector over another. What we measure when we measure gross domestic product, for example, is all the goods and services, regardless of their impact on environmental questions. Representative democracy achieves its legitimacy in part by creating a circuit of interaction between elected officials and a public that wants more, always increasing more. And any representative who seriously proposes to the public, you're going to get less of something, or there's something that you want, but we don't think it's wise for you to have it. Anyone who does that is at great risk in a democratic system, and we're seeing that in Europe right now, right? That proposals for austerity, which aren't motivated by environmental issues at all at the moment, are politically very, very dangerous and very difficult to sustain in a democratic system. But the thing that's interesting about this from the point of view of political theory is the very first proponents of democratic representation thought of representative democracy in precisely these terms, that it would be a regime that constantly fed people's desire for prosperity and maintained the conditions that were required to just keep on creating more and more things. So you can read political theorists as early as the 18th century arguing that it is a characteristic of democratic representation that it will protect property, that it won't let people touch other people's property in the name of some other ideals, and that it liberates citizens essentially to pursue what Benjamin Constant called private pleasures. That just whatever you want, you do it. And the representative system allows you to convey to your representatives your desire for more stuff. Right? So it's very difficult in a representative system to articulate any sort of critique that would call into question this desire for constantly higher levels of prosperity, with prosperity consisting of everything that people happen to want. The second thing that we think about as a sort of a deficiency to the whole system of democratic representation is what Dominique and I call a cognitive deficiency. That's a professor's term, right? We're talking about the difficulty of perceiving many ecological problems. Simply the difficulty that you and I have as just ordinary human beings, the difficulty that we have perceiving climate change as it takes place, or the difficulty we have perceiving whether a fish happens to contain a dangerous level of pesticides or something like that. Representation rests on the assumption that by and large, the people know, they can feel, they can perceive what is damaging to them. If they're hungry, they go into the streets and riot. If they are dissatisfied with joblessness because they feel the impact of that, they address themselves to their representatives. The people ordinarily have some sort of perceptual privileged position that allows them to give input into the political process that makes it possible for the representatives to take up those expressions of anger or disappointment and to convert them into policy responses. But in the case of many environmental problems, the only way that you can actually have a good grasp of these problems, the only way that you really know that they're going on around you, is through the use of scientific studies. Long-term, detailed, controlled scientific studies are required to trace the causal chains and to understand even when certain damaging sorts of conditions are before us. And so this means that it's going to be extraordinarily difficult in a representative system to get people to pay attention to environmental issues. They emerge periodically when there's a crisis, when there's a Fukushima disaster, when there's a chemical spill or something like that. But very quickly, the system goes back to more perceivable problems: joblessness, the creation of more beautiful surroundings, whatever. But things that people care about in their everyday life tend to come to the forefront very quickly. A third problem that's worth thinking about in terms of how representative government reacts to environmental problems is a problem of the incentive structures in the political system. Here I've got to talk a little bit like a political scientist for a second. When there's an environmental issue, frequently those people who are harmed by an environmental problem are dispersed across a vast territory, a large territory, with many electoral districts in it, right? So I happen to come from the state of Pennsylvania. There's a very famous river that runs through Pennsylvania, and then it goes into the ocean. And that area covers several hundred miles. All of this river is polluted especially by agriculture, by runoff from cow pastures and the chicken raising industry and so forth, so that the whole estuary system is damaged by the pollution that occurs all along this area. Now, in total, if you took up the environmental harms that are occurring to every citizen in this vast territory, it amounts to something very big. But it's very difficult to organize all of those dispersed people, right? So a person who is in Pennsylvania, one's in Maryland, one's in Delaware, how do they come into contact with one another? How do they organize? How do they express in common the fact that they are suffering some sort of damage from this local pollution? It's very difficult, especially since the political system puts them in different electoral districts. So on the one hand, your incentive as an individual citizen to get involved in correcting that pollution is really pretty small. And it's very costly for you to try to organize other people to correct that problem. On the other hand, those who are creating the problem, municipalities, some large agricultural interests and so forth, they are already concentrated. They exist in a particular area. They have employees who they talk to every day. It's very easy, or comparatively easy, to organize them. And so they can easily hire lobbyists. They can easily send representatives to the state government or the national government, and their voices are quite easily heard. So that's a sort of a persistent problem, a structural problem within representative government. Those who, in relationship to environmental problems, those people who are damaged are dispersed and find it costly and difficult to organize. The damagers are concentrated and find it fairly easy to inject their views into the system of representation. Right? And then the final point that I wanted to make is that representative democracies everywhere are usually organized according to short-term elections, right? Every 2 years in the United States, 4 years or 5 years in most of the European democracies, but very short-term elections occur for the top legislative groups in the assembly. And that means that every political participant has to pay attention to what happens in 5 years or in 2 years. I'm going to be elected or defeated according to that temporal schedule. That's when the payoffs have to appear. It's very difficult for a political representative to stake out a position on behalf of people who are going to exist in 50 years. Those people don't vote for you. They're not going to determine whether you are able to sit in the legislature in the future. Nor are people who are outside of your territorial district going to determine your electoral fate. You have to respond to some local constituency. That's the central mechanism of representative government. Short-term elections and restricted electoral constituencies. So if you're going to think about changing the responsiveness of representative democracy to environmental problems, you've got to take into account the fact that environmental problems have a very different structure from the types of problems that representative democracy was designed to solve beginning in the 18th and 19th centuries. It presents a whole series of deficiencies in relationship to these types of problems. So, suppose you were convinced, or at least tempted by this analysis. What would follow? What sort of institutional reforms are imaginable that could help overcome these deficiencies? I'm going to describe one that I find attractive and yet deeply problematic, and is going to lead me to a particular conclusion. So a few years ago, one of the top ecological political theorists in the United Kingdom, a man named Andrew Dobson, came out with a proposal for what he called ecological representation. And his proposal went something like this. I'm just going to give you sort of a real quick outline of it. he argued, much as I've just argued, that the problem with representative democracy is that it leaves a whole series of important interests unrepresented. It leaves out future generations. It leaves out ecosystems and animals in particular, so that if our representative democracies tend to pay too little attention to future generations and ecosystems and so forth, it's because they don't have representatives in the legislature. So the solution is somehow to get a special type of ecological representative into the legislature. So here's his proposal. He suggests that we could do this with a fairly limited reform of the way that most parliaments are organized. His reform would have all of us as voters decide whether we wanted to vote for one of two types of representatives. So we could vote for our ordinary representative that we have right now, or we could vote for what he calls a future generations representative. Right? So we'd have to choose. You don't get two votes. You only get one vote. Everybody still counts as only one, as only one in this system. It doesn't violate our democratic norms of equality. But you've got to choose. If you're somebody of an ecological, environmentalist disposition, you can say, you know, I think the present is pretty well represented in my polity. I'm going to vote for a future generations representative. And parties are going to organize in order to, with different programs about what the best course of action with respect to future generations should be. Right? So there would still be a competitive electoral process in which you would hear appeals from different parties, and different parties would have different visions of the way best to serve future generations environmentally, and you, as the voter, would make a decision about whether to vote for them or not. Right? And so these representatives would now be, they're still accountable. They still have the democratic feature of having to respond to another constituency that holds them accountable and responsible for their acts. So, and then I'll just, one last piece of this proposal is that Dobson claims that democratic representation could similarly be extended, and I'm quoting him here, not only to future generations, but to future species, or to other species as well as humans. He says animals could have proxy representatives, so they could have substitute representatives, people who speak for their interests in the legislature. And these representatives would have to submit themselves for re-election within a proxy constituency, that is to say, a group of voters who've decided that I'm going to use my vote exclusively for somebody who's representing a particular species. And so you would have a legislature with, apparently he's thinking that you could take something like the British Parliament or the French National Assembly or any other democratic legislature, and you could carve out or add to the number of seats that are already there. So if you take the legislature as having, say, 500 seats, maybe you would add, I don't know, 50 that were reserved for future generations and animal representatives, right? And that would mean that when it came time to have a debate in that assembly about what the polity's energy policy should be, whether there should be a carbon tax, for example, no longer would it only be representatives who are only thinking about what's going to happen to my constituents. There would now be a group of, I suppose, 50. That's not Dobson's numbers, it's a number I just chose out of a hat. But there would be a number of representatives there who were deeply engaged in environmental issues and whose vote would count in determining what the law is going to be. They would be there in the committees, they would be there to argue. There would be a different sort of dynamic in a representative legislature, provided that you had these special seats carved out for representatives who were part of who were electorally accountable and who became part of the legislature. Now, I know that there's supposed to be discussion in this room, right? And usually that probably happens at the end. If it doesn't disorganize things too much, I would like to ask if there's any reactions to this proposal. What do you think about it? Where does it go? Yeah, first over here, yes. Yeah, it entails a certain number of seats would be designated essentially environmental seats. So it's not that the Greens would have to compete with every other party. The seats are already exclusively for future generations representatives and animal representatives, something like that. Other reactions? Yes, over here.
My question was along the same lines there, but who do you see in the world now that is best placed perhaps to make this start, to incorporate these future generations representatives into their legislation?
Who do you, meaning in terms of contemporary politics and just, you know, who's...
If some nation around the world was
right.
at a point where they could perhaps take this on, who would it be?
Okay, yes. So the question was, what nation in the world could conceivably even take this task on? Who might try this as an experiment or something like that, right? My answer would be that in principle, any nation could do it. I mean, he proposed this in England, and I think he was thinking that you could do this with the British Parliament. He wasn't making a prediction that this was going to be a popular proposal and that there was a political dynamic that was leading in this direction. But he was saying that in terms of mechanics, it's not a dramatic change in a representative system to add a certain number of seats. Parliaments do that periodically. And the real dramatic change would be simply that these seats would be organized according to a slightly different electoral process. But I think he's thinking that it's conceivable. In the back, yes.
Who will decide who will occupy these places?
Right.
If there's not like other political parties,
right.
which is the process of designation of
right.
who will occupy those places?
All that Dobson says about this is that different parties would organize themselves based on a future-oriented program, and the voters would decide which of those parties would be the most attractive to have in their assembly for them. So there would be no central authority, at least as far as he's described it. There would be no central authority that says that this party can compete for this seat and this party cannot. It would be up to the voters to choose among all of the available seats. But you as a voter would have to decide whether you wanted to vote for the present or for the future. So there's an individual stake involved that if I'm going to use my future-oriented vote, then I really want to make sure that I'm selecting somebody who's demonstrated a vision of the future that I find compelling. That's about as far as he goes. I'm going to come back to that because I think there's a critical point, an important critical point to be made about this there. Yes. Yes.
I'm just wondering how you would be able to control whether these future generations representatives would actually fight for the best interests of future generations. I mean, I foresee this as the parties abusing the system to gain more seats in the parliament. Do these representatives sit in the House for a longer term, or, I mean, how would you go about that loophole?
Yeah. It doesn't address this any more than saying that these representatives are accountable to future generations' voters. So he wants to stimulate a general debate about what we should do for future generations. And he thinks that if you had parties that explicitly had to address them or dress themselves as future generations parties, you would have a different sort of debate in at least one part of the electorate. And then you would have to choose as a voter whether you thought that this party or that party was doing a good job. What he's trying to do is he's trying to preserve one of the virtues of representative government, which is pluralism, that nobody decides in advance whose values are worth pursuing. It's up to people, it's up to us as citizens to make those determinations. But at the same time, he wants to make sure that we understand that in order to preserve certain types of interests, or to get a genuine debate going about certain types of interests, you would need some different political structures in place. Anybody else have any other reactions? And I've got some critical things to say myself, and it will probably stimulate more. How about in the center there? Yes.
Okay. So I find your idea, or the idea of Dobson, quite interesting, I admit. But I wonder, I mean, being a historian, I have a different perspective. And I think whether, I mean, you talked about the social question in the 19th century, and I think there are some parallels. But they try to solve it by, I think, the Constitution. I think that's a key element. Because if you say that all men are created equal, then you have the basis for promoting women in society. And maybe we should do the same thing with nature. I mean, nowadays, we have a discussion in the European Union, as you know, about a debt break. So this is the idea that we should not spend more money than we earn, because it's not good for future generations. It's good for us now, but not for them. And maybe a kind of debt break for nature, for sustainability, would be better in, I don't know, I think it would be better because it has been proven to be efficient, because if something is unconstitutional, then you can really demonstrate and you can really complain. And there is the law and the court, and they are actually stronger than the parliament, because they can say that is unconstitutional, you have to change laws. Yeah.
I'm going to take a couple more questions, because I'm going to go in exactly the direction that you're talking about.
Well, the direction is that maybe we don't need representatives representing future generations. We just need this idea anchored in our constitution. And then all representatives have to take that into consideration. Okay. That's my idea.
Yes,
yeah.
Good. Thank you. In the back? Yes.
Hi, I'd just like to respond to this question about, may I?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'd like to respond to the question about...
I may have done that accidentally, sorry.
About the values. How can we control if the people who represent nature really are doing their best job in order to represent nature?
Right.
I just want to ask another question, like the other people who are representing the society at the moment, most people don't think they're doing a good job at the moment.
Right.
So it would be just nice to try something else, to give it a chance, and maybe all these people who are idealistic, as some of us are, would be given a voice in the parliament, in a legitimized assembly, to speak out for future generations. This might be just an idea that might transform the way we see what is good for society. Like, just to question the values that are already there in parliament that are not questioned, like growth, for example. Thank you.
And maybe one more question. Yes.
Okay, a couple of remarks. First of all, if I understood it well, you were saying that we could decide if we wanted to vote for like the normal parliament or the, let's say, 50 representative of future generations. And I'm thinking if we have really to choice between both of these, if you have only like 2 or 3 or 4% of the population who is actually voting, it could decredibilize and saying, well, it's not a major issue for the population. Another thing, in France, there is the so-called Conseil Constitutionnel, which is above the parliament and which is going exactly in that direction. and who can block or change the laws regarding the constitution. So it could be an issue. And I also just have another remark about how we can people can have an opinion about what is right for the future generations or not. And I asked a WWF member, because in Switzerland we have a lot of water dams, and I asked him, well, do you think it's a good idea? Yeah, of course, it prevents from nuclear power plants and coal power plants and so on. And do you think it would be a good idea to create more dams? Or no, because there is a huge ecological impact on some valleys and so on. So there is always, I think if he had to choose, do we have to build dams, he would have said no in the past, and now he's quite happy with the results. So there's always some kind of difficulties to know exactly in advance what would be good in the future. So it's all a couple of remarks.
Yes, good. I mean, that last remark gets at the idea that one could have very differing strategies for future generations. I mean, so if you're thinking about energy production, there might be a party that says, you know, on the whole, the best strategy for the future generations is nuclear power, right? And you could have another party that says, no, the best strategy is reductions in energy consumption. Another party might be saying that, you know, there's some range of environmentally favorable types of energy that we will exploit more, recognizing that these are going to have some costs that we accept, right? And that's the sort of competition that I think Dobson even has in mind. Let me try to draw together a number of the remarks. I think this is going to be real easy because I hear people sort of leaning where I want to go. So what a great deal for a speaker, right? The first remark I would make about Dobson's proposal is it is not a minor change in a legislature to think about including 50 more seats that are guaranteed in advance to a particular type of party or concern. That is a major constitutional change. That is a constitutional change of the first order. You can imagine, and this maybe gets to one of the questions that came over here, what polity would adopt this? Certainly, every existing legislator, every current legislator would understand that this proposal diminishes his or her influence in the legislature, right? So we shouldn't let a proposal like this make us think that, oh, this is just a small change or not a huge change anyway in the way that a representative democracy would function. This is actually a constitutional level change in every democracy that I know about. Moreover, if you're going to, and once you recognize that it is a constitutional issue, one that that affects the distribution of power among the major institutions of the state, I think you then have a responsibility to describe not only what happens in one institution, the parliament, but you have to begin to figure out how this change is going to have repercussions for other institutions that are part of the constitutional system. So, for example, again, Dobson is only giving a very, very sketchy, incomplete idea here. But clearly, this whole system would change the designation of a prime minister. Because all of a sudden, there are 50 people in the legislature who are no longer elected by the electorate as a whole. Your point a minute ago about it might be only 5% of the electorate that has elected these 5 people. What is their status in relationship to somebody like the prime minister? Do they help determine whether the government stands or falls or not? You've got to begin to think about these issues of institutional interaction. And I think the first conclusion that I'm coming to as a result of having worked through many arguments like Dobson's is that if you take the natural question seriously, if you take that issue of the deficiencies of representative government in relationship to environmental problems, if you're convinced by that, you are pushed to the level of thinking about constitutional change. because our representative democracies are formatted in a particular way to promote and recognize certain types of interests. And if you want to interject a consistent concern for future generations, for other species and so forth into our system, you're going to have to think about levels of change that will actually have an impact on the entire institutional workings of a democratic system. Right? So, and this gets me, I guess, to another comment that was made here, which is we're talking now about constitutions. We're not just talking about legislatures. We're talking about who makes the laws, who enforces the laws, what their relationships to other institutions are. But also, I found working through an argument like Dobson's really helpful for coming to some conclusions about whether representation, as we know it, is even an adequate way of thinking about these types of environmental challenges. Let me start off with the idea of future generations, and I think this was behind perhaps your remark earlier. When we have a representative government, one of the reasons why representative governments have been reasonably stable and have created a certain level of satisfaction in many political systems is because representatives are in constant interaction with the people. I mean, they're out there trying to sell programs, they're listening to people, and their careers are constantly at issue, you know, whether they've satisfied the electorate or not. There's a constant dialogue taking place. And when they encounter resistance from people, because they encounter resistance all the time, what they do is they try, well, hopefully to persuade you. They give you reasons to change your mind, right? Or maybe they offer you incentives. They say, yes, you're going to be damaged by this particular law. Your interests are going to be hurt. But we can build you a new playground in your neighborhood, and that'll take some of the hurt away. You know, they arrange trade-offs and bargains. You can't do any of that with future generations, right? You can't buy them off. You can't assuage them. You can't persuade them. They don't exist yet. And that means that whatever a future generation's representative does, it doesn't look like representation as we know it. It's a theory that somebody has. It's a conception. It's a vision of the future. It's a vision of certain values that they want to have that they think would be good for future generations. It's perhaps a hypothesis about where technology is going to take us in 50 years or 100 years, but it's not a representative relationship of going back and forth with other people. To think that a future generation's representative is going to be like a representative is really, I think, misleading. They've got a very different role to play in a political system. What he wants in terms of what he wants to inject into a political system is some sort of systematic knowledge, or at least the best knowledge we have about where our current use of resources and our current practices are taking us, and what the ramifications are going to be for a few generations in the future. Yes, in the back. Yes, absolutely empathy for those people. So my first critique is that he's called this a representation issue, but it's not. It's not a representation issue in the way that anybody else sitting in Parliament has to think about representation. Everybody else in Parliament has to go back to their constituency and plead and beg and cajole and engage in all sorts of political maneuvering in order to get the electorate in general to go along. The future generations representatives go back to some militants, probably some people who are some activists who are really, you know, gung-ho about the environment, and they have some sort of limited interchange with them, and the electorate as a whole simply has to deal with the change and balance of power that comes out of that sort of negotiation. That's a huge. So one conclusion that I came to out of this was that these people, if we're talking about changing the Constitution and somehow injecting concern for future generations into it, you're not going to get there by thinking about these people as representatives as we know them. There's an even worse problem, though, I think, here, which is, and I think this was foreshadowed in a couple of the critical comments as well. He's thinking that voters will choose between being future generations or current generation voters. Right? So imagine that, and he's also imagining, I guess, that because of this new political impulse that's injected into the legislature, because of it, the legislature is going to make some different decisions. So perhaps there's a legislative proposal out there right now to reintroduce wolves or bears into a territory, right? And the ranchers and the sheep herders and so forth really don't like this idea, right? But let's suppose that because of the presence of animal representatives in the body, this new piece of legislation actually does pass, right? So now a law is passed to introduce sheep or introduce wolves into a territory in which there are going to be shepherds who are dissatisfied with this. If you're a shepherd, if you're a sheep herder, what are you going to do in the next electoral round? Are you going to vote for the current generation or a future generation representative? Now your sheep are being eaten occasionally by wolves. I'll tell you what I would do. The next electoral round, I'm voting for a future generation's representative, and I'm going to count that there's going to be some party out there that will develop a program that allows for the exclusion of wolves from the territory, right? Every political party would certainly put together a future generation's surrogate party, right? That would advance its current generation interests, but by camouflaging them in the language of future generations. I'm sure of that, right? So that after one or two electoral rounds, you would find that when you got your future generations ballot, there would be the pro-nuclear ballot, there would be the anti-wolf ballot, there would be a whole bunch of parties there that would enable you to make exactly the same choices that you made as a current generation person. I'm pretty sure that that's going to be the outcome, is if these representatives really influence things, people with power figure these things out very quickly, and the system reverts to its old form. That too indicates that maybe the idea of representation is the wrong concept to use in terms of figuring out what these new political actors would be like. So, that puts me on the line, though, because you're going to be asking yourselves, so what does Whiteside want? What would be the conclusion? First conclusion is we have to talk about constitutions. My second conclusion is that the introduction of environmental interests, future interests, other species, ecosystems, and so forth, cannot be thought of as being integrated in current legislatures. Current legislatures will always be the theater of interest group bargaining and short-term reasoning. They will be that. Because of their electoral structure, their temporal structure, and the ways that we think about using representation to serve our interests. So if you're going to have some sort of institution that deliberately injects these environmental interests into the political system, we need to think about a third chamber. We need to think about some sort of institution that is not integrated in the legislature, but is part of the scheme of checks and balances that exists in the Constitution as a whole. I'll give part of the inspiration for this idea I got many, many years ago in reading a book by a young German Green who went on to have quite a career. This was 25 years ago. Joschka Fischer wrote a book in which he said that what Germany needed was an environmental ministry that is powerful in relation to the federal government, I'm quoting him now, one that is able to handle conflict, eine konfliktfähige Stellung, and that has an independent constitutional position analogous to that of the central bank. Now, when Germans talk about central banks, they're serious, right? And that analogy is very striking because the legitimacy of something like the central bank rests on the supposition that there is some sort of common interest in protecting the currency. There's some sort of common interest in making sure that the dangers of inflation and financial fraud are kept under control. In fact, it's so important that those particular types of interests are not well served in the legislature. Because legislatures control budgets, they're constantly interested in spending more, and they're trying to pay off constituencies and so forth. And so the idea of an independent central bank is that there's a category of issues out there that are not well handled in a strictly representative setting. We have to construct a different type of institution that has its own mission and that has its own types of members in order to protect those particular values. Now, the French historian and political theorist Pierre Rosanvallon has argued that this sort of institution has become increasingly common within representative democracies. Not only independent central banks, but also constitutional courts. And so we heard a little bit before about the Conseil constitutionnel. Is another type of institution. It's not an elected institution. It is not an institution that is integrated into the legislature, but the legislature has to react to the concerns that come out of these independent institutions. So these institutions exist and they have real power. They're not just advisory institutions. They're not just saying it's a good idea to have an austerity plan or to protect individual rights. They have a veto of sorts on certain types of things that legislatures might otherwise want to do. But Rosanvallon argues that they're nonetheless serving a democratic purpose because every democracy exists in a field of time. And some institutions really serve well the existing current interests of the people. Other institutions look backwards to the founding principles of the political system, and they work to protect those against the interests of the present. And that's what a constitutional court or a Supreme Court does, in effect. It's not alien to the interests of the people. In fact, it represents, in a sense, the sort of the long-term interests of adhering to certain principles. And then something like a central bank also is looking towards a certain sort of stabilization of the permanent interests of the people. So what I'm suggesting is that as we begin to think about what sort of constitutional changes might be necessary, we have to think about an institution that stands apart from the legislature, that the legislature has to answer to in certain ways. That it would be an institution that has some power, that can say things about what legislatures want to do. Now, Dominique Bourg and I have, in our book on Vers une démocratie écologique, so towards an ecological democracy, we began to sketch out what this sort of institution might look like. And we argued that this institution would have probably only a suspensive veto over legislative proposals. So the dynamic that we had in mind would be that the Assemblée Nationale, the Senate, or whatever the two major legislative bodies are, would come up with their legislative proposals. But this third institution would be able to say, stop. You haven't sufficiently taken account of future generations' interests here. You've come up with an energy plan that satisfies today's consumers very nicely, but you're not thinking about what's going to happen with climate change in 20 years. Go back and think about your plan again. And so they would be able to intervene in the legislative process in a way that essentially compelled the traditional representative bodies to revisit their issues in light of a reasoned argument about what future generations might require. Okay? You can count on the following, I think, that once such an institution existed, the existing legislative bodies, the ones that we're familiar with, would begin to think differently. They would realize that they're wasting their time coming up with a proposed law if it doesn't, in some ways, anticipate future generations. They don't want to face that suspensive veto. Right? So their activities would change even before they had to pass their law onto this other body. If they did pass something that was clearly defective to the other body could introduce this suspensive veto. And therefore, they would have to go back and revisit the issue. And a suspensive veto usually means that the originating body does have the last word. So, in other words, this wouldn't be a definitive veto. This institution gets one shot. It gets one chance to try to correct the course of legislation. But it's able to do that by intervening, by using the suspensive veto. Thing goes back to the original bodies. They revisit it. And if they still persist in whatever their original plan was, that the other body found unsatisfactory, what we've said so far is, so be it. So that there's some, because we've been reluctant to imagine a body that could have the authority to completely overturn laws that came out of a popular assembly. Nonetheless, we believe that this sort of authority would be enough to inflect legislation in ways that made a difference. I'll just conclude with one scenario, perhaps. Both in the United States and in France, so the two polities that I'm most familiar with, there have recently been proposals for sort of large-scale control or a large-scale transition towards more sustainable uses of energy. Obama came to office in 2008 with saying that the environment was going to be high on his agenda. Nicolas Sarkozy in France came announcing that a carbon tax was going to be at the forefront of his interest for environmental legislation in France. In both cases, midterm elections within 2 or 3 years completely took those off the agenda. The governing party suffered a reversal of fortunes, and they immediately said, oh, this policy is political poison. We're not going to pursue it any further. That's how representative government works. But if there were this third institution, every party would know that their legislation has one more stage to go through. And that means that they have to anticipate the sort of environmental critiques that they would get out of this other organization. That would reinforce the hand of anybody in the current legislature to actually put forth more enterprising and daring environmental proposals, because they know that there's another institutional support already in place for that. Or at least they would gamble that support would manifest itself. So I've told you only in the barest outline what Dominique Bourg and I are thinking about, but it is that sort of thing. It is creating a third chamber specifically charged with environmental type questions that figures into the scheme of checks and balances that governs constitutions as a whole. Fini. Merci beaucoup. Other questions in the back? Yes, thank you.
I'd like to know what might be the composition of this third institution. If there will be like just politicians, scientists, or civil society too, and how to decide that, because there's any specialization about future generation.
Okay,
So
that's right. This is the next book that I'm writing with Dominique Bourg. And we're talking about some of these issues this afternoon. So this issue of composition is absolutely crucial. And we've been trying to figure out how you respond to the issue that what I call the cognitive deficiency of representative governments. The fact that environmental issues don't mobilize people in a sustained way in proportion to the seriousness of the problems they face. And Dominique and I are very impressed actually by the role of scientific ecology in the ways that many of these ecological problems become known in the political system. So we're trying to figure out a way in which part of the composition of this assembly would be scientific, credentialed scientists. Not just people who can play to the electorate by promising you that global warming really isn't occurring or that it's simply God's punishment for Democrats ruling in America and things like that. So part of it, I think, would have to be that there would be some sort of selection procedure for scientists, for credentialed scientific advisors in this body. So scientists would be a little bit to this body the way that jurists are to a constitutional court, or the way that people with economic training and some business background have ended up being in central banks. It's important to realize this is only one institution among many, and it doesn't have an absolute veto over anything. But the other thing that I add, and this I've got to push Dominique on, so you can help me with this. There are some students of Dominique out there. I think that environmental, non-governmental organizations need to play a role a little bit like political parties in relationship to this organization. I mean, environmental, non-governmental organizations, like Greenpeace, like the World Wildlife Federation, and many, many others, are unique in the fact that they really are concerned about this natural question. That's the forefront of their concern, and they assemble citizens around them. So they do part of the sort of active engagement with people that is necessary in order to create any sense of legitimacy in a democratic system. They also are frequently a source of what is called counter-expertise. I'm not happy with the idea of leaving any branch of government in the hands just of scientists. And I think that there are many environmental, non-governmental organizations that have done a really good job, actually, of challenging scientists, of trying to highlight values other than just sheer material concerns about the environment. That environmental questions involve also questions of natural beauty. They also involve questions of access to areas where we can replenish our spiritual resources. And those are valid things to take into consideration also, as well as sort of scientific predictions about what this or that chemical is doing to the environment. So I imagine a mixed body that has some scientists and that has some chosen participants out of environmental, non-governmental organizations. And I'll just say I'll just reveal my hand at one other point here, which is that we think that there's a particular role for random selection in the creation of such a body. That is to say, not selected by politicians directly, not selected by an electoral process, but instead, some sort of large pool of candidates is created, all of whom are potentially eligible to sit on this, and then a lottery is held to determine which ones get the seats. And we think that that's really important because what it does is it means that those who are sitting on this powerful council, those who are sitting there they don't have to mobilize an electorate, which is expensive. Right? That's what political parties are always up against. They don't just communicate, they have to collect money in order to communicate and to constantly to set up bureaus, to write up literature. And money is precisely what allows organized interests to get into the political process. As soon as you need money to be able to win a seat in your representative assembly, it means that you've got to listen to those who have money in preference to those who don't. It's almost a law of politics. What a system of random selection could do is make it unpredictable who gets those seats. Right? So interest groups can't know in advance that this person or that person is about to sit on this body. I'm therefore going to support them. I'm going to give them campaign money and so forth. This person doesn't owe his or her seat to anybody but the fact that they've been randomly selected out of a large pool of potentially credentialed candidates. One of the most important features of this particular type of system is somehow to create a piece of our government that doesn't see economic growth automatically as its top priority, that understands that there are other values and other considerations, part of which are scientific, part of which are social and value-oriented, that have to be articulated and have to count in the political process. And in order to create a body that has that degree of independence, you have to think of some particular way of selecting them that shelters them a little bit from the movings of a capitalist economy. It's very difficult to figure out how to do that. We think that random selection could play a role. How about that? Okay, yes.
I'd like to know also, would it work like an advisory institution?
An adversary
Yeah.
institution? Yes.
Or, I mean, when the other chamber will
Right.
talk about any issue,
Right.
they will ask an advisory
Okay,
from
yes.
this
Right.
third institution, or
Right.
if this institution will make
Yeah.
this decision about everything.
Right.
I don't know.
I hadn't actually staked out a position on that yet, but I don't see anything wrong with it being advisory. Like in France, the Conseil constitutionnel does provide advice to the legislature if it sees a piece of legislation, I believe that it thinks is going to be very problematic in terms of the French Constitution. It doesn't have to wait until the legislature has acted in order to say, you might want to think about this more. I don't see any problem with that in advance. Yes. Yes, good. I need devil's advocates.
Thank you. In order to have power, the people that you're communicating with need to acknowledge that you hold power.
Yes.
What would your argument be to our local, our even national governments to say you need to acknowledge this body and its power?
Right.
I mean, I'm from Canada, and I can't even conceptualize it in my mind that the Harper government right now would say, oh yeah, come on in and veto all of our plans for the next however many years.
Right. I think the legitimacy of it, the argument that you have to make is that there is a genuine common interest in addressing these types of issues. That right now, the way in which we address most of these issues of technological adaptation to environmental change, to environmental deterioration and so forth, is through the interplay of interest in our regular legislatures. Right? And part of the answer to that has to be that doesn't work for our new era, and people have to be convinced of that. So at some level, you've got to make a case, just like the case has been made for independent central banks or for constitutional courts, that there is a type of problem out there that we're always going to have now. It's a huge issue. It affects almost everything that we do, and yet organizationally we're not prepared to deal with it. So we need some sort of organization. I guess in answer to the question that actually started the whole discussion is, well, how can you imagine any country actually ever adopting this? And you know, so there's a question of political dynamics. What would ever thrust us forward? I have to admit that it's hard to imagine the political circumstances that would get them to adopt this at the moment. I suspect that it would take a series of catastrophes, that is a series of concentrated catastrophes when people begin to say, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of things going on that we don't feel like we control anymore. A little bit of this happened in the 1990s with the introduction of genetically modified crops in Europe. And that came right on the heels, right after the mad cow problems of sanitation. And people began thinking differently about whether their institutions were protecting them in ways that they cared about. So I don't like to think in terms of catastrophes being sort of the inciting thing for this. But I think we do have to realize that, as Moscovici said, we're in a new era. Directly or indirectly, humanity is going to have an impact on everything from now on. We decide what lives and what dies. We decide what the genetic structure is of things that we live with. We may decide the genetic structure of ourselves within a generation or so. Do we have the political mechanisms? Are the political mechanisms that we've inherited from the 18th century the ones that allow us to address those questions very well? Right now, I don't think so. Yes.
Yes, but, well, I sympathize with your idea. I honestly do, but with all due respect, I think we do have the framework to make these changes. I mean, if you want to change something, it's difficult. We all know that. And so I think that it's best to say we keep the framework, we make as few changes as possible, because that's easier than making lots of changes, and trying to achieve it. So I still claim that our constitution is the center of our society. No one stands above it. So if you have a constitutional amendment, which has occurred throughout history, then you make a change, which is quite difficult, but it's just one change within the framework. And then we have the media, we have the Supreme Court, and as you said, before passing law, they have to consult law and the Constitution, whether it's all right with the Constitution or not. So why it may work, of course, but you need so many changes. Why a third chamber? Why all this when you can have it within our political framework, but adding constitutional amendments? That's my question, actually.
A constitutional amendment, say, for environmental rights of some specified sort? Is that what you mean?
Just a constitutional amendment that whenever you pass laws, you have to consider the future impact on our society, and according to it, make the law. Like human dignity, for instance, or other constitutional issues we think that are crucial to our society.
I mean, just real quick response. I mean, I guess that I would say that in relationship to many of these issues, our institutions have incentives built within them that run counter to these, to systematically taking these things into account. Lots of countries have added environmental rights to their constitutions, but that doesn't change the fact that if you're a representative, you have to get reelected in 5 years, and there's a depression right now. People want jobs, and they want cheap gas, and so it's much easier to get elected on those grounds than it is on the other ones. And so far, at least, again, I don't know all political systems. You know more about this than I do, probably. so far, I don't know that of Supreme Courts that have overruled legislative entire laws because they were insufficiently protective of the environment. But I'd love to hear.
Heard in Italy. I mean, in the south of Italy,
Uh-huh.
recently there's it's back industrial region, and if it is damaging people for decades now, and the constitution there said you have to either close or close it, or you have to invest a lot of money in order to improve environmental issue. So it can happen.
Good. Thank you. Last question? Last question. It's got to be really good.
Okay. It was just a comment to the constitutional argument, because the constitution is an important tool to secure, like, the basic needs of society, but with the concerns of future generations and also other species, I think that it gets too specific and it gets to a point where the constitution just isn't practical. Because, for example, constitutional rule of having to consider something doesn't really imply what result you come. You just have to consider it, and you can say, I've considered it, and it just comes down to opinion. So I think that a third chamber would be more efficient if you compare it to the economy, for example. We would never ensure those, like, steering of the interest rate and all that in the constitution because it's too specific and it's dynamic. So that's why I think that an institution would be more efficient.
Thank you. I want to thank you again so much for this. And the comments I've gotten here have been better than I got at the Collège de France. So this is really been a thrill to be here. Thank you so much.